Hey there, and welcome to Crime for Sleep. I know you're having trouble falling asleep, so let me keep you company with true crime stories from around the world. Before we dive in, I'm curious, where did you first hear this one? If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Now get comfortable, and let's get into tonight's case. Story 1. I had been fixated on the wall for longer than I could measure, where the grain of the wooden panel appeared to ripple like a distant, silent current. The room refused to settle, its corners breathing with an undercurrent of unease, resonating in the faintest vibrations underfoot. Every so often, a draft would tease the edges of the wallpaper, whispering of spaces beyond. I clung to the illusion of normalcy, convinced I'd regain my peace if only something tangible would break the monotony. But the shift was imperceptible, a shadow that never was, resting just beyond the threshold of sight. The coffee cup. The porcelain rim bears a hairline crack that runs from the handle to where my lips would rest. I remember purchasing this cup from a shop that smelled of cinnamon and dust, though I cannot recall when or why I chose this particular one. The stain inside has darkened over time, a brown ring that no amount of scrubbing removes. It sits on the table beside me, half filled with liquid that has long since grown cold. The surface tension creates a perfect mirror, reflecting the ceiling light in a way that makes it appear to pulse. I wonder if I actually drank from it this morning, or if the memory is simply another fabrication my mind has constructed to fill the gaps. The photograph asterisk. Face down on the mantel, the silver frame catches light from the window at precise intervals throughout the day. I know what image it contains, yet I haven't turned it upright in weeks. The backing paper has begun to peel at one corner, revealing the manufacturer's stamp in faded blue ink. When I first placed it there, the photograph faced outward, a constant reminder of something I believed to be true. Now its concealment feels more honest somehow, as if acknowledging that memory itself might be unreliable. The dust has settled in a perfect rectangle around its edges, marking the exact boundaries of what I've chosen to hide from view. The basement door. Its brass handle has worn smooth from countless touches, though I cannot remember the last time I actually opened it. The wood around the lock shows scratches, small gouges that could have come from keys fumbled in darkness or haste. Sometimes I hear sounds from below, not footsteps exactly, but a settling that seems too rhythmic to be the house adjusting to temperature changes. The door frame is slightly warped, creating a gap at the bottom through which cool air seeps upward, carrying with it a scent I cannot identify but somehow recognize. I've convinced myself that the basement holds only forgotten storage boxes and seasonal decorations, yet I find myself avoiding that hallway entirely. The garden gloves. They lie crumpled beside the back door, fingers curled inward as if still grasping something. The leather has stiffened with dried earth that flakes off when touched, leaving dark crescents beneath my fingernails. I remember wearing them while planting bulbs that should have bloomed by now, though the garden bed remains conspicuously bare. The right glove shows a tear across the palm, and I wonder what sharp object caused it. When I hold them up to the light, I can see through the damaged leather to the newspaper I stuffed inside for shape. The headlines are still visible, though I cannot make out the words from this angle. The kitchen window. Condensation forms patterns on the glass that resemble fingerprints, though I live alone and rarely have visitors. The view beyond shows the neighbor's house, where a single light burns in an upstairs window at all hours. I've never seen anyone move past that illuminated square, yet something about its constancy unsettles me. The window latch sticks when I try to open it, as if it hasn't been used in months, though I distinctly remember letting in fresh air just days ago. Beneath the sill, the paint has begun to bubble and peel, revealing layers of previous colors like geological strata of the house's history. The telephone. Its black receiver rests in the cradle at an angle that suggests recent use, though I cannot recall making or receiving any calls. The cord has twisted into a tight spiral that speaks of nervous fidgeting during long conversations. When I lift the handset, the dial tone sounds different than I remember, slightly higher in pitch, with an almost imperceptible echo. The rotary dial bears fingerprint smudges on certain numbers, creating a pattern that might reveal frequently called contacts if I cared to analyze it. Sometimes, in the deep quiet of night, I hear it ring once before falling silent, though when I check, no missed calls register on the display. The mirror in the hallway. My reflection appears slightly delayed, as if the silvered surface must process my image before returning it. The frame is antique, inherited from someone whose name I can no longer recall with certainty. Around the edges, the backing has begun to deteriorate, creating dark spots that obscure portions of whatever it reflects. I've noticed that certain angles reveal not just my face, but glimpses of the room behind me that seem to contain furniture I don't recognize. The mirror hangs from a chain that is stretched over time, causing it to tilt at an angle that makes everything appear slightly off-kilter. The bookshelf. Several volumes lean against each other with gaps where other books once stood, though I cannot remember removing anything recently. The dust patterns suggest frequent handling of certain titles, while others appear untouched for years. One book falls open to the same page whenever I pick it up, as if the spine has developed a memory of being held at that particular passage. The text discusses the unreliability of witness testimony, how memory can be influenced by suggestion and expectation. I don't recall purchasing this book, yet my name is written inside the front cover in handwriting that resembles my own. The floorboard. Beneath the living room carpet, certain boards creak in a sequence that sounds almost like Morse code when I walk across them. The pattern has become so familiar that I find myself unconsciously avoiding those spots, stepping around them in a dance I don't remember learning. Near the window, one board sits slightly higher than the others, creating a small ridge that catches my toe if I'm not careful. The wood grain runs in different directions in that section, suggesting repairs or replacements that predate my occupancy. When the house is very quiet, I sometimes hear similar creaking from other rooms, as if someone else is learning the same careful choreography. The light switch. The plastic plate around the switch has yellowed with age, but the screws that hold it in place appear newly tightened. When I flip it up or down, there's a slight delay before the overhead bulb responds, accompanied by a barely audible buzzing that seems to come from within the walls themselves. My fingerprints have worn smooth patches on the switch's surface, evidence of countless daily interactions I don't consciously remember. Sometimes I find lights on in rooms I'm certain I left dark, though I live alone and have no explanation for the discrepancy. The clock on the mantel. Its hands move with mechanical precision, yet the time it displays never quite matches the other timepieces in the house. The pendulum swings in a hypnotic rhythm that seems to slow when I watch it directly, resuming normal speed only when I look away. The chiming mechanism has fallen silent, though I cannot pinpoint when I last heard it mark the hours. Behind the glass face, I can see the intricate gears and springs, all moving in their prescribed patterns, yet something about their motion appears reversed, as if time itself were running backward within that ornate wooden case. The curtain's asterisk. Heavy fabric that blocks most of the natural light, creating a perpetual twilight in the room. The pattern depicts pastoral scenes that seem to shift depending on the viewing angle, sometimes showing shepherds with their flocks, other times revealing empty fields beneath storm-heavy skies. The material feels damp to the touch, though there's no obvious source of moisture. When drawn back, they reveal windows that look out onto a landscape I don't remember from when I first moved here. The view has somehow changed, or perhaps my perception of it has altered in ways I cannot articulate. The doorknob asterisk. Brass that is tarnished in places where hands have gripped it, leaving ghost impressions of fingers larger than my own. The mechanism turns smoothly in one direction but catches slightly when rotated the other way, as if the internal springs have developed a preference. Sometimes I find doors ajar that I distinctly remember closing, though the house shows no signs of forced entry or unauthorized access. The key that fits this lock hangs on a ring with several others, though I cannot identify what the additional keys might open. The shadows. They fall at angles that don't correspond to the position of the sun or the artificial lighting in the room. The darkness pools in corners where it shouldn't logically accumulate, creating shapes that suggest presence without revealing source. As the day progresses, these shadows don't shift in predictable patterns but seem to move independently, rearranging themselves when I'm not looking directly. In the periphery of my vision, they sometimes appear to contain movement, though when I turn to investigate, I find only empty space and the familiar objects of my daily life. The final element asterisk. The silence itself has become a tangible thing, pressing against my eardrums with weight that fluctuates like breathing. Within this quiet, I detect layers of sound so faint they might be imagined whispers that could be wind through unseen gaps, footsteps that might be settling timber, voices that dissolve into nothing when I strain to hear them clearly. This absence of obvious noise has become more unsettling than any disturbance could be, suggesting that something waits just beyond the threshold of perception, patient and observant, cataloging my movements just as I have cataloged these details that may or may not hold the answers I seek. Story 2. It started as a slight imperfection, a single dog-eared page in the magazine on the coffee table. Every week, another page was folded down, marking a new corner unnoticed at first. I'd straighten them, thinking it was just a quirk of the paper or perhaps a passing breeze. Each time I returned it to its place, the next issue would arrive with yet another corner turned. 5 weeks in, the routine was broken. This time, the magazine lay untouched, pristine. But the corner of the newspaper in the next room was bent instead, and I'm certain I was reading it just yesterday. The coffee table. The surface bears rings from countless mugs, ghostly circles that catch the light at certain angles. I run my fingers across the wood grain, feeling for the slight depression where someone once pressed too hard with a pen. The magazine sits precisely where I left it, yet something about its position feels deliberate now, as if placed rather than casually set down. The wood remembers pressure differently than my mind remembers placement. When I shift the magazine an inch to the left, the outline beneath remains visible in the dust, a perfect rectangle that suggests it hasn't moved in weeks. The spare key asterisk. Hidden beneath the third flower pot from the door, it should be warm from the afternoon sun. Instead, the metal feels cold against my palm, as if recently handled. The key slides into the lock with the familiar resistance of old mechanisms, but today there's a smoothness to the turn that wasn't there before. Someone has oiled the hinges recently, though I can't recall doing so myself. The door opens without its usual complaint, silent as a held breath. I examine the key more closely and notice tiny metal filings caught in the teeth, fresh scratches that weren't there when I last used it. The hallway mirror. My reflection stares back, but the angle seems wrong somehow. The mirror hangs exactly where it always has, yet I appear taller, or perhaps the perspective has shifted. Behind my shoulder, the hallway stretches differently than I remember, the shadows falling in unfamiliar patterns. I step closer and notice fingerprints on the glass, not mine, smaller and more delicate. They form a pattern as if someone traced the outline of my face while I wasn't looking. The frame shows signs of recent adjustment, tiny scratches in the wall where it might have been rehung. The kitchen window. The view should be unchanged, the same garden, the same fence line, the same neighbors shed in the distance. But the curtains hang differently today, pulled back just enough to frame a different section of the yard. I don't remember adjusting them, yet they're positioned to provide a clear sightline to the back door. The windowsill holds a thin layer of dust except for two clean spots where elbows might have rested. The glass itself bears the faint outline of a palm print pressed against it from the outside. When I breathe on the surface, condensation reveals letters that someone traced there, now invisible but still present in the oils left behind. The telephone. Silent for days now, it sits in its cradle with the receiver slightly askew. The cord shows signs of recent handling, coiled differently than my usual neat loops. When I lift the handset, there's a warmth to the plastic that suggests recent use, and the faintest trace of an unfamiliar perfume clings to the mouthpiece. The last number dialed isn't one I recognize, though the area code seems familiar in a way that makes my stomach tight. I dial it back, but the line goes immediately to a generic voicemail that reveals nothing. The phone bill will show the call, but somehow I know I'll never see that particular statement. The bedroom closet. My clothes hang in their usual order, but the spacing between hangers has changed subtly. Someone has moved through them, perhaps searching, perhaps simply touching. A blouse I haven't worn in months now hangs at the front, while my favorite sweater has migrated to the back. The floor shows indentations from shoes that aren't mine, smaller prints pressed into the carpet pile. On the shelf above, my jewelry box sits at a different angle, and when I open it, the contents have been rearranged with a care that suggests familiarity with my belongings. A necklace I thought I'd lost gleams from the bottom compartment, returned to a place I never would have put it. The basement door. The handle turns more easily than it should after months of neglect. Someone has been down there recently, their passage marked by disturbed dust on the stairs and a lingering scent of soap in the stale air. The light bulb at the bottom glows steadily, though I'm certain it burned out weeks ago. Boxes have been moved, their positions shifted just enough to create pathways between them. One container sits open, its contents partially removed and then carefully replaced. Inside, old photographs have been sorted through, some missing from their usual spots, others arranged in a sequence I don't remember creating. The garden shed. The padlock hangs open, though I distinctly remember securing it after my last visit. Tools have been used and cleaned, their surfaces gleaming with fresh oil. The rake shows traces of recent soil, dark earth clinging to its tines despite the dry weather we've been having. Someone has been digging, though where remains unclear. A shovel leans against the wall at an angle that suggests hurried replacement, and the floor bears muddy footprints that lead from the door to the tool rack and back again. In the corner, a tarp has been folded with military precision, its edges aligned in a way that speaks of practiced hands. The mailbox. Letters arrive in the wrong order, bills dated after personal correspondence, yet delivered first. The mailman's routine has changed, or perhaps there's a new carrier who doesn't understand the usual patterns. Some envelopes show signs of steaming, their flaps slightly warped as if they've been opened and resealed. The contents remain intact, but they feel different somehow, as if handled by too many fingers. One letter bears a postmark from a town I've never heard of, addressed in handwriting that mirrors my own so closely it makes my hands shake. Inside, a single sheet of paper contains a list of my daily activities, accurate down to the time I water the plants. The bathroom medicine cabinet asterisk. Bottles have been moved, their positions subtly altered behind the mirror's reflection. Someone has read the labels, perhaps made notes, certainly showed more interest in my prescriptions than seems healthy. The aspirin bottle rattles with fewer pills than I remember, and the sleeping aids have been reduced by exactly 3 tablets. A prescription I finished weeks ago has been refilled without my knowledge, the new bottle appearing overnight like an unwelcome gift. The mirror itself swings differently on its hinges, adjusted to accommodate someone shorter than myself, someone who needed a different angle to see inside. The living room carpet asterisk. Footprints emerge in the pile when the light hits at just the right angle, a trail that leads from the front door to the kitchen and back again. The pattern suggests someone who knows the layout well, who can navigate in darkness without bumping into furniture. Near the couch, an indentation marks where someone sat for an extended period, the cushions still holding the memory of their weight. A book lies open to a page I don't remember reading, with passages underlined in pencil so light it's barely visible. The bookmark has moved forward 3 chapters, though I haven't touched the book in days. The Arctic Oxa. The pull cord hangs lower than usual, stretched by recent use. Insulation particles dust the hallway floor beneath the opening, and the ladder shows fresh scratches where it scraped against the frame. Someone has been up there, moving carefully through my stored memories, sorting through boxes of photographs and documents with the patience of an archaeologist. A single footprint in the dust reveals a shoe size smaller than mine, with a distinctive wear pattern on the heel. When I climb up to investigate, I find my old diary open to an entry from years ago, the page marked with a flower pressed between the sheets, a flower that wasn't there when I wrote those words. The kitchen table. 2 place settings remain from a meal I don't remember preparing, the plates clean but showing water spots that suggest recent washing. Crumbs from an unfamiliar bread scatter the surface, and a wine glass holds the ghost of lipstick in a shade I've never worn. The salt shaker sits precisely in the center, equidistant from both place settings, as if someone took care to make the arrangement perfectly symmetrical. Beneath one plate, a napkin bears the impression of handwriting, words pressed through from a note written elsewhere. Letters that spell out my name and something else I can't quite decipher. The front door locked. The mechanism has been lubricated recently, the key turning with suspicious smoothness. Tiny metal shavings glitter in the keyhole, evidence of lock picks or perhaps a key that doesn't quite fit. The door frame shows microscopic scratches where tools might have been inserted, and the weather stripping has been disturbed in a pattern consistent with forced entry. Yet nothing appears to be missing, nothing obviously disturbed except for this growing catalog of small violations, these intimate intrusions that suggest someone who knows me better than I know myself. The answering machine asterisk. The red light blinks with messages I don't remember receiving, voices that speak my name with familiar affection but faces I can't place. One caller mentions a conversation we had yesterday, recounting details of a meeting that never happened, thanking me for advice I never gave. Another leaves a reminder about an appointment I never made, speaking as if we've known each other for years. The timestamp shows the calls came while I was home, yet I heard no ringing, saw no flashing light. When I try to save the messages, they vanish, leaving only the electronic hum of an empty system. The back door. It stands slightly ajar, though I'm certain I locked it before retiring. The gap is precisely wide enough for a hand to slip through, for fingers to work the deadbolt from the inside. The door jamb bears fresh gouges where a crowbar might have been applied, but the damage has been carefully concealed with wood stain that nearly matches the original finish. Outside, the porch light has been unscrewed just enough to dim its glow, creating shadows perfect for concealment. In the soft earth beside the steps, a single clear footprint points toward the house, while several others, smudged beyond recognition, lead away into the darkness. The newspaper lies exactly where I left it, its corner still folded down in that precise triangle that catches the lamplight like a signal. But now I notice the crease runs through a photograph, bisecting a face that looks remarkably like my own, and I realize I haven't read a newspaper in months. Story 3. It smelled like rich, damp soil, the kind you'd expect to encounter in a dense, shadowed forest, not in the sterile hallway of an office building. The aroma settled into the creases of my clothes, stirring a memory that clung like cobwebs. I hesitated by the elevator, my fingers brushing the cool metal of the buttons. The scent drew me toward the conference room, its door ajar, leaking tendrils of darkness into the corridor. The room was empty save for a desk chair that faced away, slightly skewed as if recently abandoned. This smell wasn't new. It once enveloped me in places where sunlight rarely reached. I shouldn't be chasing it, yet I found myself stepping inside. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that makes shadows seem darker by contrast. I touched the back of the empty chair, still warm. The fabric held the faintest impression of someone who had been sitting there moments before, someone who carried the forest with them. Or maybe I'm remembering this wrong. Maybe the chair was cold. The case files are still in my desk drawer at home. I should have thrown them out years ago, but they remain there like artifacts from another life. Sometimes I catch myself pulling them out late at night, spreading the photographs across my kitchen table under the yellow glow of the overhead bulb. The pictures never change, but my interpretation of them shifts like sand. She was the type of person who seemed to exist in the periphery of other people's lives, the kind you notice but don't really see. Her colleagues described her as quiet, efficient, the sort who ate lunch alone while reading paperback novels with worn spines. She had a habit of arriving early and staying late, not out of ambition, but from what appeared to be a reluctance to leave. I remember the first time I interviewed her supervisor. He sat across from me in his cluttered office, fingers drumming against his coffee mug. She was reliable, he said, never caused problems, kept to herself mostly. But there was something in the way he avoided my eyes when he said it, a hesitation that felt practiced, as if he'd rehearsed the words. When did you last see her? The usual time, end of the workday. She gathered her things, said goodnight to the security guard, same as always. Same as always, the phrase stuck with me. I wrote it down in my notebook, circled it twice. Later, when I reviewed my notes, I couldn't remember why I'd found it significant. The security footage showed her leaving the building at 6:17 in the evening. She wore a dark coat, carried a leather bag slung over her shoulder. The camera angle made it impossible to see her face clearly, but her gait seemed unhurried, normal. She disappeared around the corner, and that was the last confirmed sighting. Or was it 6:19? I've watched that footage so many times the numbers blur together. Back in the conference room, I found myself examining the table's surface. Someone had left behind a single sheet of paper, blank except for what looked like the impression of writing from another page that had been placed on top of it. I held it up to the light, trying to decipher the ghost words pressed into the fiber. The indentations formed shapes that might have been letters, but I couldn't make sense of them. The forest smell was stronger near the window. I pressed my palm against the glass and looked down at the parking lot below. A few scattered cars sat under the sodium lights, their windshields reflecting the amber glow. Nothing unusual, nothing that would explain the earthy scent that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Her apartment had been modest, unremarkable. The landlord let me in after showing me his copy of the key, a small brass thing that turned in the lock with surprising ease. Everything appeared undisturbed. Bed made with hospital corners, dishes washed and put away. A single coffee mug sat in the sink, a brown ring staining the bottom. She was a good tenant, the landlord told me. Quiet, paid on time, never any complaints from the neighbors. I walked through her rooms like an archaeologist examining ruins. Her books were arranged alphabetically on shelves that showed no dust. Her closet contained clothes in muted colors, hung with mathematical precision. On her bedside table sat a small digital clock and a glass of water, half empty. Or half full, perspective matters. In her desk drawer, I found a collection of receipts organized by date. Grocery stores, gas stations, the occasional restaurant. A paper trail of ordinary existence, but tucked between the receipts was something else, a business card for a hiking supply store. The edges were worn as if it had been handled frequently. I called the store. The woman who answered had a voice like gravel. Sure, I remember her, came in maybe once a month, always bought the same things. Trail mix, water purification tablets, those emergency blankets. Said she liked to be prepared. Prepared for what? Didn't say some folks are just like that, you know, always thinking ahead. But her colleagues insisted she never mentioned hiking, never talked about outdoor activities at all. The contradiction gnawed at me like a splinter under the skin. The conference room chair creaked when I sat in it. I tried to imagine who had been here before me, what they might have been thinking about. The forest smell seemed to pulse with my heartbeat, growing stronger and then fading, as if the building itself were breathing. My notes from the investigation read like fragments of different stories, witness statements that didn't quite align, timeline discrepancies measured in minutes that felt like hours. Everyone remembered her differently or claimed not to remember her at all. The security guard described her as friendly, always offering a smile and a greeting. But the night janitor said she barely acknowledged his presence, hurrying past with her eyes fixed on the floor. Two people, same building, completely different versions of the same woman. I started to wonder if we were talking about the same person at all. Her bank records showed regular deposits and withdrawals, nothing unusual, but there was a pattern I almost missed. Small cash withdrawals every 2 weeks, always on the same day. $40 each time, not enough to raise suspicions, but consistent enough to suggest purpose. I spent days trying to trace where that money went. Gas stations, convenience stores, anywhere that might have security cameras or transaction records. The trail led nowhere, dissolving into the anonymous flow of cash transactions that leave no digital footprints. The hiking store business card bothered me. I drove out there one afternoon, a 40-minute trip through increasingly rural roads. The store sat at the edge of a state forest, its wooden facade weathered by seasons of rain and sun. Inside, the air smelled of canvas and leather with undertones of something else, something familiar. The same woman I'd spoken to on the phone stood behind the counter. She looked at me with curious eyes. "You're the one asking about her," she said. It wasn't a question. I'm trying to understand what she was preparing for. "Aren't we all preparing for something?" She gestured toward the shelves lined with emergency supplies. Some people stock up on canned goods, others buy generators. She bought peace of mind. "What kind of peace of mind?" "The kind that comes from knowing you can disappear if you need to." The words hung in the air between us like smoke. I wanted to ask more questions, but she turned away, busying herself with inventory sheets that didn't need her attention. Outside, I sat in my car and tried to process what she'd told me. The forest stretched beyond the parking lot, its canopy thick enough to block most of the sunlight. Trails wound into the darkness between the trees, marked by small wooden signs that gave distances to various landmarks. I found myself wondering how far a person could walk before they were truly lost. Back in the conference room, I realized I'd been sitting in the same position for longer than I'd intended. The building had grown quiet around me, the usual sounds of office life fading into the white noise of ventilation systems and humming electronics. The forest smell persisted, neither stronger nor weaker, as if it had always been there and I was only now learning to notice it. I thought about the hiking supplies, the cash withdrawals, the business card worn smooth by handling. Pieces of a puzzle that refused to form a complete picture. Or maybe they did form a picture and I simply didn't want to see it. Her computer showed no unusual activity. Email correspondence limited to work-related matters and the occasional online purchase. Browser history revealed nothing more interesting than weather forecasts and news websites, but buried in her deleted files, I found something the initial investigation had missed, a document titled Emergency Contacts. The file was empty. Not deleted, not corrupted, simply empty, as if she'd created it with the intention of filling it out later, but never found anyone worth adding to the list. I stared at that blank document for a long time, trying to understand what it meant. Everyone has someone. Family, friends, coworkers who might qualify as emergency contacts, but she had created a file and left it empty, as if the act of naming it was enough. The investigation stalled after 6 weeks. No new leads, no witnesses coming forward with additional information. The official conclusion was that she had left voluntarily, though no evidence supported that theory beyond the absence of evidence suggesting otherwise. People disappear sometimes. It happens more often than we like to admit. But I kept the files, kept returning to them when sleep wouldn't come, spreading the photographs and reports across my table like tarot cards that might reveal hidden truths if I arranged them correctly. The conference room window reflected my image back at me, ghostly and indistinct. Behind my reflection, the parking lot stretched into darkness. I wondered if she had stood at a window like this one, looking out at the world she was preparing to leave behind. Or maybe she never intended to leave at all. Maybe the hiking supplies and cash withdrawals were something else entirely. Insurance against a threat I couldn't identify. Preparation for a danger that existed only in her mind. I found myself thinking about the empty emergency contact file, the deliberate creation of something meant to remain unfilled. There was a kind of poetry in it, a statement about solitude that felt both tragic and intentional. The night janitor had mentioned something during our interview, a detail so small I almost overlooked it. She had started carrying a different bag in the weeks before her disappearance. not the leather shoulder bag captured on security footage, but something larger, canvas with multiple pockets. Like a camping bag, he said when I pressed him for details. You know, the kind with all the straps and buckles. I never found that bag, not in her apartment, not in her car, not in any of the places she might have left it. Its absence felt significant, though I couldn't articulate why. The hiking store owner had said something about disappearing, about buying peace of mind. I wondered if that was what the bag represented, not preparation for adventure, but preparation for vanishing. A portable life reduced to essentials that could be carried into the forest and beyond. Standing in the conference room, surrounded by the smell of damp earth and growing things, I felt closer to understanding than I had during the active investigation. But understanding and knowing are different things. I could sense the shape of what had happened without being able to name it. She had been planning something. The supplies, the cash, the worn business card all pointed to preparation. But preparation for what? A new life somewhere else, a final walk into the woods, or something else entirely, something I lacked the imagination to conceive. The building's heating system cycled on, pushing warm air through vents that carried the forest smell to every corner of the room. I closed my eyes and let it wash over me, trying to decode what it meant. Earth and decay, growth and decomposition. The smell of things returning to the ground from which they came. When I opened my eyes, the chair across from me seemed occupied by absence. Not empty, but filled with the presence of someone who was no longer there. I could almost see her sitting there, hands folded in her lap, waiting for something or someone that would never come. The security guard had been wrong about her friendliness, or the janitor had been wrong about her aloofness, or they had both been right and she had been different things to different people, adapting herself to what each situation required. A chameleon of personality, blending into backgrounds until she was barely visible at all. I thought about the empty emergency contact file again, the conscious decision to create something and leave it unfilled. Maybe it wasn't about having no one to call in an emergency. Maybe it was about not wanting anyone to be called, a declaration of independence from the networks of obligation and concern that bind us to our lives. The investigation had focused on finding her, but maybe the real question was why she had wanted to be lost. What circumstances make disappearance seem like the only viable option? What kind of life becomes so unbearable that vanishing into uncertainty feels like freedom? I stood up from the chair, my legs stiff from sitting too long. The conference room felt smaller than it had when I entered, as if the walls had moved closer while I wasn't paying attention. The forest smell clung to my clothes, my hair, my skin. I would carry it with me when I left, another fragment of a mystery that refused to resolve. Outside in the hallway, the elevator waited with doors open, as if it had been expecting me. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the ground floor. As the doors closed, I caught a final glimpse of the conference room, the empty chair still turned at that slight angle, still holding the impression of someone who had been there and then wasn't. The elevator descended through floors of darkened offices, past windows that looked out onto a world where people could simply choose to stop existing in the ways they had before. I thought about the hiking trails that wound into the forest, marked by signs that gave distances but not destinations. How far would someone have to walk before they were no longer the person they had been when they started? The lobby smelled like cleaning solution and recycled air, normal smells that belonged to normal places where normal people lived normal lives, but the forest smell lingered underneath, a reminder that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. Some disappearances are not crimes but choices, not tragedies but transformations. I pushed through the glass doors and stepped into the night air. Above, stars struggled to shine through the urban haze, distant and cold. I wondered if she could see them now, wherever she was, if she looked up at the same sky and felt the satisfaction of having successfully erased herself from a world that had never quite fit. Or maybe she was nowhere at all. Maybe the forest had claimed her as completely as it claimed fallen leaves and broken branches. Maybe the smell that followed me was all that remained, a ghost of intention that would haunt conference rooms and empty chairs until someone else came along to wonder what it meant. I walked to my car, keys heavy in my pocket. Tomorrow I would return to other cases, other mysteries that might actually have solutions. But tonight I would go home and pull out the files one more time, spread them across my table under the yellow light, and try to understand what I had learned in that room where the forest had somehow taken root. The answer felt close enough to touch, but touching and grasping are different things. Some truths are meant to be sensed rather than known, felt rather than understood. She had become one of those truths, a presence defined by absence, a story told in the spaces between words. I started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, leaving the building behind. But I took the forest smell with me, and the memory of an empty chair, and the knowledge that somewhere in the darkness between certainty and doubt, she had found exactly what she was looking for, story 4. I had just turned off the lamp. The gentle hum of electronics winding down lingered in the background, a faint harmony to the settling dust. My fingertips brushed the textured wall, mapping out the familiar landscape, feeling ridges that seemed deeper than before. The air was still, yet my breath caught on something unseen, a presence that my skin traced like a shadow. It was a soft sensation, elusive, like a memory trying to resurface, and the room didn't seem to agree with itself anymore. But I knew what had happened here. The facts were simple, documented, filed away in manila folders that smelled of old coffee and fluorescent lighting. My partner had been working late that night, hunched over the desk where papers still lay scattered in careful disorder. The investigation had been consuming both of us for weeks, but particularly him. He'd developed that hollow look around his eyes, the kind that comes from staring too long at crime scene photographs and witness statements that never quite aligned. The break-in occurred sometime after midnight. The perpetrator had entered through the back window, the one that never latched properly despite our repeated complaints to the landlord. My partner had been alone, reviewing case files when the intruder surprised him. There had been a struggle. The overturned chair, the papers strewn across the floor, the lamp knocked askew all evidence of a violent confrontation that ended with my partner unconscious and our most sensitive case materials stolen. I'd found him the next morning, slumped against the filing cabinet, a knot on his temple the size of a golf ball. He couldn't remember much about the attack, just fragments, a shadow moving too quickly, the smell of cigarettes and something else he couldn't identify, hands that seemed familiar but weren't. The doctor said mild concussion, temporary memory loss, nothing unusual given the circumstances. The missing files contained everything we'd gathered about the disappearance of that young woman from the apartment complex across town. 3 months of interviews, surveillance notes, forensic reports that had finally started pointing toward a suspect. Now it was all gone and we were back to square one. The timing wasn't coincidental. Someone had wanted those files badly enough to risk breaking into a detective's home office. But as I stood there in the darkness, running my fingers along those textured walls, something felt wrong about the whole narrative I'd constructed. The ridges under my fingertips seemed too deep, too deliberate. When had we textured these walls? I couldn't remember choosing that particular pattern. couldn't recall the renovation that would have created such pronounced grooves in what had once been smooth drywall. The smell hit me then, faint but unmistakable. Cigarettes, yes, but underneath that, something medicinal. Antiseptic, maybe, or was it something else entirely? The scent seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, as if it had been absorbed into the very structure of the room over time. I'd noticed it before, but dismissed it as residue from the previous tenants. Now it felt significant, purposeful. I reached for the light switch, then stopped. In the darkness, I could think more clearly about that night. My partner's story had been consistent from the beginning, never wavering in the details he could remember. But consistency itself can be suspicious. Real trauma creates jagged memories, fragments that shift and change with each telling. His account had been too clean, too organized for someone who'd suffered a head injury. The overturned chair bothered me now in ways it hadn't before. It lay on its side next to the desk, but the angle was wrong. If someone had been sitting there and been surprised by an intruder, the chair would have fallen backward, not to the side. And the papers scattered across the floor, they weren't random. Looking at them now with fresh eyes, I could see a pattern. The most crucial documents, the ones that contained our breakthrough information about the suspect, those were the only ones missing. Everything else had been left behind. Even files that would have been valuable to someone looking to compromise other investigations. My partner had insisted we not report the break-in to our superiors. He'd said it would compromise the case, make us look incompetent, unable to protect our own materials. At the time, his reasoning made sense. We were close to solving the disappearance, and any delay could give the real perpetrator time to cover his tracks or flee. But now his reluctance to involve other officers felt like something else entirely. I moved through the room in darkness, my hands exploring surfaces I thought I knew. The desk drawer that should have been locked was slightly ajar. Inside, my fingers found files that should have been stolen, documents that my partner had sworn were taken. They were there exactly where they'd always been, undisturbed and complete. The breakthrough information we'd supposedly lost, the evidence that pointed toward our suspect, it was all intact. The young woman's disappearance had consumed us both, but it had affected my partner differently than I'd initially realized. He'd taken personal time to interview her neighbors, spent his own money on surveillance equipment, worked through weekends without being asked. I'd attributed his dedication to professional pride, but now I wondered if there had been something else driving his obsession with the case. Her photograph was still pinned to the bulletin board above the desk. Even in the darkness, I could sense its presence, the way her eyes seemed to follow movement around the room. She'd been beautiful in that fragile way that made people want to protect her, with dark hair that caught light like water and a smile that suggested secrets. My partner had mentioned her smile several times during our investigation, always in the context of witness interviews, but with a familiarity that suggested he'd studied it extensively. The apartment complex where she'd lived wasn't far from here. I'd driven past it countless times during the investigation, noting the layout, the security cameras, the blind spots where someone could enter or exit unseen. But I'd never paid attention to how often my partner suggested we conduct surveillance from locations that offered a clear view of her specific unit. He'd known which apartment was hers before we'd officially identified it, had guided our investigation toward her building with a certainty that I'd mistaken for good detective work. The medicinal smell was stronger now, or maybe I was just more aware of it. It reminded me of something specific, but the memory hovered just beyond reach. Hospital corridors, maybe, or a pharmacy. No, something more personal than that, something domestic. The first aid kit in our bathroom medicine cabinet had that same antiseptic scent, the one my partner had used frequently during the weeks following his supposed attack. He'd complained of headaches, dizziness, symptoms that required regular medication. But I'd never seen him take any pills. The bottle in the medicine cabinet remained full, the seal unbroken despite his daily complaints about pain. And the knot on his temple, the evidence of his assault, had healed remarkably quickly for such a severe injury. By the end of the first week, there was barely a mark, no bruising, no tenderness when he accidentally bumped it against the car door while getting out. I found myself questioning not just the break-in, but everything that had led up to it. The case files spread across the desk that night. Had they really been about the missing woman, or had they been something else entirely? The papers I'd seen scattered on the floor the morning I found him, were they the same documents I'd observed him working on, or had they been placed there deliberately, staged to support a story that was already falling apart in my mind? The back window, the one that supposedly never latched properly, felt secure when I tested it now. The mechanism worked smoothly, clicking into place with the solid sound of metal meeting metal. There were no scratches around the lock, no signs of forced entry, nothing to suggest it had ever been compromised by an intruder. The window faced our neighbor's yard, where motion sensor lights would have illuminated anyone attempting to climb through. Those lights had never been triggered that night. My partner's behavior in the days following the break-in began to take on new significance. He'd been eager to close the missing woman's case, to declare her a runaway rather than a victim of foul play. He'd argued that we'd exhausted all leads, that continuing the investigation was a waste of resources. But the files I'd just discovered in the desk drawer told a different story. We'd been closer to finding her than he'd led me to believe. The surveillance footage from the apartment complex, the interviews with her coworkers, the forensic analysis of her abandoned car, all of it pointed toward someone who knew her routine, someone who had access to her building, someone she might have trusted enough to let into her apartment. The suspect profile we'd developed described someone methodical, patient, possibly in law enforcement or a related field. Someone who understood how investigations worked, who could anticipate the questions we'd ask and the evidence we'd seek. I realized I was holding my breath, standing perfectly still in the darkness as pieces of a different puzzle began to arrange themselves in my mind. The young woman hadn't disappeared randomly. She'd been targeted by someone who had studied her, learned her habits, gained her trust. And when the investigation got too close to the truth, that same someone had created a distraction, a false break-in that would derail our progress and buy time to cover tracks that were becoming too obvious. The presence I'd felt when I first turned off the lamp wasn't a memory trying to resurface. It was awareness, finally breaking through months of willful blindness. The room disagreed with itself because I'd been seeing it through someone else's version of events, accepting explanations that served their interests rather than revealing the truth. The textured walls, the antiseptic smell, the carefully staged evidence, all of it had been there from the beginning, waiting for me to stop believing what I'd been told and start trusting what I could observe. But observation required courage, and courage meant accepting that the person I'd trusted most in this investigation might be the same person we'd been hunting all along. It meant acknowledging that I'd been not just a detective on this case, but potentially an unwitting accomplice, providing cover and credibility for someone who needed both to continue operating undetected. The darkness around me felt different now, not empty, but full of possibilities I wasn't ready to examine. My partner would be home soon, expecting to find me asleep, unaware that I'd discovered the files he'd hidden, the evidence he'd claimed was stolen. I could confront him, demand explanations, force the truth into the open. Or I could continue pretending, keep playing my role in whatever elaborate performance we'd been staging for months. But pretending meant accepting that somewhere out there, a young woman might still be alive, might be waiting for someone to piece together the clues that had been scattered deliberately to confuse rather than illuminate. And it meant acknowledging that I might be the only person in a position to find her, the only one who could see through the carefully constructed lies that had replaced our investigation with something that served entirely different purposes. The gentle hum of electronics had stopped completely now. In the silence, I could hear my own heartbeat, steady but accelerated, the sound of a body preparing for action it couldn't yet define. My fingertips remained pressed against the textured wall, feeling ridges that seemed to spell out a message I was only beginning to understand. The truth wasn't something that had been stolen from us. It was something that had been hidden in plain sight, disguised as its opposite, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. In that moment, I realized with a certainty that felt both terrifying and inevitable, had finally arrived. Story 5. The button failed to light up. My finger hovered over it, expecting the familiar glow, but all remained dim. The walls seemed to shrink, closing in, and the air felt unusually thick as I descended. The usual hum of the cables was absent, leaving only a void pressing against my ears. I reached out to touch the cold railing, but it lacked its customary chill. The floor beneath me didn't vibrate with the descent. When the doors finally opened, the hallway beyond seemed to lean away, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the ground wasn't quite level. I stepped out carefully, my shoes making no sound against the polished floor. The building's basement level had always been quiet, but this silence felt different, heavier, more deliberate. I was here to meet my colleague about the missing files, the ones that had vanished from our shared project. She'd called that morning, her voice tight with concern, asking me to come down to the storage room where we kept the older documents. Something about needing to show me what she'd found. The fluorescent lights cast their usual harsh glow, but shadows seemed to pool in corners where they'd never gathered before. I counted the doors as I passed 3, 4, 5 until I reached the storage room at the end of the hall. The door stood slightly ajar, which struck me as odd. We always kept it locked. Inside, boxes lined the metal shelving units in perfect rows. Everything appeared normal at first glance. My colleague sat at the small table we'd set up for reviewing documents, her back to me. Her dark hair fell forward, obscuring her face as she bent over a manila folder. "You found something?" I asked, stepping closer. She didn't respond immediately. When she finally looked up, her expression seemed distant, almost confused. "I'm not sure what I found," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "These papers, they're not what we filed away." I moved around the table to see what she was examining. The documents looked familiar, our project reports, correspondence, meeting notes, but something felt wrong about them. The dates seemed off, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly how. The handwriting looked like mine, but slightly different, as if someone had tried to replicate my style. "When did you first notice they were different?" I asked. She hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of a page. "This morning, when I came down to look for the quarterly summaries, but now I'm wondering if they were always like this, and I just never paid close enough attention." That's when I noticed the smell, a faint metallic scent that reminded me of old coins or rain on pavement. It hadn't been there when I first entered the room, I was certain of that. But as I breathed it in, something stirred in the back of my mind, a memory that felt both familiar and foreign. I found myself staring at a water stain on the ceiling that I'd never seen before. It was roughly circular, with irregular edges that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at it. The stain appeared fresh, as if water had recently leaked through, but the ceiling felt dry when I reached up to touch it. "Did you hear that?" my colleague asked suddenly. I paused, listening. There was nothing, no sound from the elevator shaft, no footsteps in the hallway above, no hum from the building's ventilation system. The silence was so complete it made my ears ring. "I don't hear anything," I said. "Exactly." She stood up, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound that seemed too loud. "It's too quiet, even for down here." I wanted to reassure her, to explain away her concerns with logic and reason. Buildings had their quiet moments. Documents could be misfiled or mixed up. Memory was unreliable, especially when stress was involved. But as I opened my mouth to speak, I caught sight of my reflection in the glass door of a filing cabinet. I looked tired, more tired than I remembered feeling. There were dark circles under my eyes, and my shirt was wrinkled in a way that suggested I'd been wearing it longer than just since morning. But I distinctly remembered putting on a fresh shirt that day, even remembered choosing it from my closet. My colleague was watching me with an expression I couldn't read. "How long have we been working on this project?" she asked. The question should have been simple to answer. We'd started in the fall, I was sure of that. But when I tried to count the weeks or months, my mind felt foggy, as if I were trying to remember something through thick glass. "A few months," I said finally, though the words felt uncertain as they left my mouth. She nodded slowly, but I could see doubt flickering in her eyes. I keep thinking about that day we first discussed it, in the conference room upstairs, but when I try to picture it clearly, the details keep changing. I knew what she meant. The memory felt slippery, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. I remembered the meeting, remembered agreeing to collaborate, but the specifics, who else was there, what exactly we'd decided, even what the weather had been like that day, all of it seemed to shift and blur when I focused on it. A door slammed somewhere in the building above us, the sound echoing down through the floors. But instead of making the silence feel less oppressive, it somehow made everything seem more isolated, as if we were the only people left in the entire structure. I picked up one of the documents from the table, a report I was certain I'd written just weeks ago. But as I read it, I found passages I didn't remember composing, conclusions I wasn't sure I agreed with. My signature at the bottom looked right and wrong at the same time, too neat, too careful, as if someone had practiced it. "Maybe we should go back upstairs," my colleague suggested, but she made no move toward the door. I nodded, but I didn't move either. Something was keeping us there, some invisible weight that made leaving feel impossible. The air grew thicker, pressing against my lungs with each breath. The fluorescent lights began to flicker, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. That's when I saw a second set of footprints in the dust near the back wall. They were faint, barely visible, but they definitely hadn't been there when we arrived. They appeared to lead from the door to where we were standing, then simply stopped, as if whoever had made them had vanished into thin air. My colleague followed my gaze and gasped softly. Those weren't there before. But even as she spoke, I began to doubt my own perception. Had I really looked at that spot when I first came in? Was I certain the footprints were new, or was I just noticing them for the first time? The metallic smell grew stronger, mixing with something else, a musty odor that reminded me of old books or forgotten attics. I felt dizzy, as if the floor were tilting beneath my feet. The walls seemed to pulse gently, breathing like living things. I closed my eyes, trying to center myself, trying to separate what I knew from what I feared. But behind my eyelids, images flashed, fragments of scenes I couldn't quite place. A different room, darker than this one. A conversation that felt urgent, desperate, hands reaching for something just out of reach. When I opened my eyes, my colleague was staring at me with concern. "Are you all right? You looked like you were somewhere else for a moment." I wanted to tell her about the images, about the growing certainty that something fundamental was wrong with this entire situation, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself nodding, forcing a smile that felt like a lie. "Just tired," I said, though I wasn't sure if that was true either. She gathered the documents into a neat pile, her movements careful and deliberate. "Maybe we should take these upstairs, look at them in better light." I agreed, but as we prepared to leave, I noticed that the water stain on the ceiling had changed shape. It was larger now, more irregular, and it seemed to be spreading even as I watched. Drops of water began to fall, landing on the table with soft, rhythmic taps. But when I looked up again, the ceiling was dry, unmarked by any stain. The sound of dripping water continued for a few more seconds, then stopped abruptly, leaving only that oppressive silence. My colleague seemed oblivious to what had just happened. She was already at the door, waiting for me to follow. But as I moved to join her, I caught another glimpse of my reflection in the filing cabinet glass. This time I wasn't alone. There was another figure standing behind me, shadowy and indistinct, but undeniably present. I spun around, but the room was empty except for my colleague, who was looking at me with growing alarm. "What is it?" she asked. I turned back to the glass, but now it showed only my own reflection, pale and shaken. "Nothing," I said, but my voice cracked on the word. As we left the storage room, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The hallway stretched ahead of us, longer than I remembered, and our footsteps echoed strangely, as if the sound were being reflected back from walls that weren't quite where they should be. The elevator was waiting for us, doors open, interior lit by that same harsh fluorescent glow. But as we stepped inside, I noticed that the button panel was different. There were more floors than before, including several basement levels I was certain hadn't existed when I'd come down. My colleague pressed the button for the main floor, but nothing happened. She tried again, then looked at me with confusion. "It's not responding." I reached over to try the button myself, but my hand passed right through it, as if it were made of light rather than solid matter. The doors began to close, though neither of us had pressed anything, and I felt that familiar sensation of movement, though the floor didn't vibrate and there was no sound from the cables. When the doors opened again, we weren't on the main floor. We were back in the basement, but the hallway looked different now, darker, with walls that seemed to curve away into shadows. The storage room door stood open, just as we'd left it, but light spilled out in a way that defied the laws of physics, casting impossible angles across the floor. "This isn't right," my colleague whispered, and I realized she was beginning to see it too, the wrongness that had been growing around us like a slow tide. We walked back toward the storage room, though neither of us had consciously decided to do so. Our feet moved of their own accord, carrying us forward into that spill of impossible light. Inside, everything was exactly as we'd left it, except for one detail that made my blood run cold. There were now 3 sets of footprints in the dust. I looked at my colleague, and she looked back at me, and in that moment I understood that we were both thinking the same thing. If there were 3 sets of prints, and only 2 of us had been in the room, then who had made the 3rd set? The question hung between us like a physical thing, heavy and inescapable. The fluorescent lights continued their irregular flickering, and somewhere in the distance, I could swear I heard the faint sound of breathing that didn't belong to either of us. But even as fear crept up my spine, another part of my mind was already working to rationalize what we were experiencing. Stress could cause hallucinations. Fatigue could distort perception. Old buildings were full of strange sounds and shifting shadows. There had to be a logical explanation for everything we'd seen and heard. Yet as I stood there in that impossible light, surrounded by evidence that contradicted everything I thought I knew about reality, I couldn't shake the feeling that logic might not be enough to save us from whatever truth was slowly revealing itself in the darkness of that basement room. The documents on the table rustled softly, though there was no breeze to move them, and I realized that our investigation into those missing files had led us somewhere far stranger and more dangerous than either of us could have imagined. Story 6. I had just brushed the dust off my hands. The floorboards felt unusually warm, each creak underfoot resonating with unexpected clarity. My skin tingled in the dim light as if sensing vibrations too subtle to catch with my ears. The scent of old wood mingled with the faint aroma of burnt wax, teasing fragments of forgotten rituals. My pulse quickened with each silent step toward the doorway where the air shimmered like a thin veil. Something shifted, and the quiet felt newly alive. The nausea comes first. It always comes first, rolling through my stomach like a tide of thick oil. I press my palm against the wall and the coolness seeps through my skin, but it doesn't help. Nothing helps anymore. The feeling sits in my chest, heavy and wrong, like swallowing stones. I've carried this weight for weeks now, maybe months. Time has become elastic, stretching and contracting without my permission. My therapist would say I'm dissociating again. She would lean forward in that practiced way, her pen poised above her notepad, and ask me to describe the sensation. But how do you describe the feeling of being hollowed out from the inside? How do you explain that your own memories feel like they belong to someone else? The basement, I keep coming back to the basement. There was a chair down there, wooden with a curved back. I remember running my fingers along its surface, feeling the grain beneath my fingertips. The wood was smooth in some places, rough in others, as if someone had sanded it unevenly. Or maybe those rough patches were something else entirely. Scratches, deep gouges that caught my nail when I traced them. But that's not right. There was no chair. The basement was empty except for the furnace and those boxes stacked against the far wall. Boxes filled with old photographs and documents that smelled like decay. I opened one once and found pictures of people I didn't recognize, their faces blurred and distorted as if the camera had moved during exposure, or as if they had been moving. The woman in the photographs had dark hair. She smiled in some of them, but her eyes remained flat and lifeless. In others, she wasn't smiling at all. Her mouth was a thin line pressed tight with what looked like fear or anger or both. I studied her face for hours, searching for something familiar, some connection that would explain why these pictures were in our house. Our house, was it our house? The memory shifts and blurs like smoke. Sometimes I remember living there for years, knowing every creak and shadow. Other times it feels foreign, as if I were visiting a stranger's home. The walls were painted yellow in the kitchen, or maybe they were blue. The uncertainty makes my teeth ache. She used to stand by the window in the morning light, the woman from the photographs. No, that's impossible. The photographs were old, faded with age. The woman in them would be elderly now if she were still alive. But I can see her so clearly, her silhouette backlit by the pale dawn, her hands pressed against the glass as if she were trying to push through it. I asked about her once. The question fell from my lips before I could stop it, and the silence that followed was deafening. The air in the room changed, became thick and oppressive. I felt like I was drowning in that silence, gasping for words that wouldn't come. Who was she? But no one answered. Maybe no one was there to answer. Maybe I was alone in that kitchen, staring at an empty window, talking to shadows and dust motes dancing in the morning light. The headache started around then, sharp, piercing pains that would strike without warning, leaving me gasping and disoriented. The doctor said it was stress, prescribed pills that made everything feel muffled and distant. I stopped taking them after a week because the distance was worse than the pain. At least the pain felt real. Reality has become negotiable. I find myself questioning everything, doubting my own perceptions. Did I really see her that night, standing at the foot of the stairs? Her nightgown was white, almost luminous in the darkness, and she moved without making a sound. When I blinked, she was gone, but the floorboards where she had stood were warm to the touch. The basement door was always locked. I remember that clearly, or I think I do. The key hung on a small hook beside the refrigerator, tarnished brass that left green stains on my fingers. But sometimes I would go to get it and find the hook empty, the key nowhere to be found. Those were the nights I would lie awake, listening to sounds from below, footsteps, the scraping of furniture being moved, soft voices having conversations I couldn't quite understand. I started keeping a journal, thinking it would help me sort through the confusion. But when I read back through the entries, they contradicted each other. In one entry, I wrote about finding the basement empty. In another, I described it as furnished with antique pieces covered in white sheets. The handwriting was mine, but the words felt foreign, as if someone else had guided my hand across the page. The mirror in the upstairs bathroom showed me things that weren't there, or maybe it showed me things that were there but shouldn't have been. Reflections that moved independently, faces that appeared and disappeared in the periphery of my vision. I covered it with a towel, but that made things worse. The covered mirror felt like a presence, watching and waiting. She had a birthmark on her left shoulder, shaped like a crescent moon, dark against her pale skin. I know this with absolute certainty, though I can't remember how I know it. The knowledge sits in my mind like a foreign object, sharp and uncomfortable. When I try to trace the memory back to its source, I find nothing but empty space. The photographs began to change. I would look at them and see different expressions, different poses. The woman's smile would be wider or more strained. Her hands would be positioned differently. Sometimes there would be shadows in the background that I hadn't noticed before, dark shapes that might have been furniture or might have been something else entirely. I started avoiding the basement altogether. The very thought of descending those stairs filled me with a dread so profound it made my knees weak. But the sounds continued, muffled by the floorboards but unmistakably present. Sometimes I would press my ear to the floor, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The wood was always warm against my cheek, as if heated from below. The dreams came in fragments, pieces of scenes that felt more like memories than imagination. I would wake with the taste of dust in my mouth and the sensation of splinters under my fingernails. My hands would be dirty, though I couldn't remember touching anything. The dirt was dark, almost black, and it smelled like earth after rain. In the dreams, I was always searching for something, moving through rooms that were familiar yet wrong, opening doors that led to spaces that shouldn't exist. The woman was there sometimes, just out of reach, always disappearing around corners or through doorways that closed before I could follow. The journal entries became more erratic. Sentences that started in the middle of thoughts, words scratched out so violently they tore through the paper. I found pages I didn't remember writing, filled with the same phrase repeated over and over until it lost all meaning. She's still here, she's still here, she's still here. But who was still here? The woman from the photographs, the shadow by the window, or someone else entirely, someone I had forgotten or chosen not to remember. The basement door stood open one morning. I found it that way when I came downstairs, yawning wide like a mouth. The darkness beyond seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, breathing in and out with mechanical precision. I stood at the threshold for what felt like hours, my hand on the door frame, feeling the vibrations travel up through the wood. The stairs descended into blackness. 13 steps, I counted them once, though sometimes there seemed to be more. The wood was worn smooth by countless feet, polished to a shine that reflected what little light filtered down from above. Each step creaked with a different pitch, creating a discordant melody that echoed off the walls. I found the chair again, or it found me, sitting in the center of the basement floor as if it had always been there, as if my memories of an empty space were the fiction. The wood was darker than I remembered, stained with something that might have been water damage or might have been something else. The seat was worn smooth, shaped by years of use. There were ropes on the floor beside it, thick hemp rope coiled like a sleeping snake. I picked up one end and the fibers were soft against my palm, worn smooth by handling. But that doesn't make sense. Why would there be rope in the basement? What purpose could it serve? The photographs were scattered around the chair's base like fallen leaves. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all showing the same woman at different ages. As a child, her dark hair in braids, her smile genuine and bright. As a teenager, more reserved, her eyes holding secrets. As a young woman, beautiful but haunted, shadows gathering beneath her eyes like bruises. I gathered them up, my hands shaking. In some of the pictures, she wasn't alone. There were other figures, faces that had been carefully scratched out with something sharp. The scratches were deep, gouged into the photographic paper with violent precision, but I could still make out fragments, a hand here, a shoulder there, the edge of a smile that looked familiar. The smell of burnt wax was stronger down there. It clung to everything, sweet and cloying, mixing with the earthier sense of dust and decay. I followed it to a corner where dozens of candle stubs sat melted into the concrete floor. They had burned down to nothing, leaving only puddles of hardened wax in various colors, white and red and black, swirled together like spilled paint. She used to light candles every night. The memory surfaces without warning, sharp and clear. She would move through the house at dusk, touching flame to wick with ritualistic precision. The light would flicker and dance, casting moving shadows on the walls. She said it kept the darkness at bay, but I think it invited something else in. The headaches are getting worse. They come in waves now, crashing over me with such intensity that I sometimes lose consciousness. When I wake, I'm in different places. Once I found myself in the basement, curled up on the cold floor beside the chair. Another time I was standing in the backyard, my feet bare and dirty, staring up at the house as if seeing it for the first time. The mirror upstairs shows me her face now instead of my own. She looks older than in the photographs, aged by something more than time. Her skin is pale and waxy, her eyes sunken deep into their sockets. When I move, she doesn't move with me. She just stares, her mouth moving as if she's trying to speak words I can't hear. I've stopped sleeping in the bedroom. The bed feels wrong, contaminated by dreams that aren't dreams. I curl up on the living room couch instead, but even there I'm not safe. The sounds from the basement have grown louder, more insistent. Footsteps climbing the stairs, stopping just outside the door. The soft whisper of fabric against wood, breathing that isn't my own. The journal has become a lifeline, the only thing anchoring me to some version of reality, but even it betrays me. I write one thing and find another when I read it back. Conversations I don't remember having, descriptions of events that couldn't have happened. The handwriting shifts and changes, sometimes neat and controlled, sometimes wild and barely legible. Today's entry simply says, "I remember now." But I don't remember. The words are there in my own hand, but they feel like lies. What am I supposed to remember? The woman in the photographs, the chair in the basement, the ropes and candles and scratched-out faces. The basement door is open again. It's always open now, as if the lock has given up trying to keep its secrets contained. The darkness beyond pulses with invitation, promising answers to questions I'm afraid to ask. The floorboards above it have grown warmer, hot enough now that I can't stand on them for long without my feet burning. I found more photographs today. These were hidden behind the furnace, wrapped in oilcloth to protect them from moisture. They show the basement as it is now, furnished and arranged with careful precision. But they're old, faded with age. How can they show the present if they were taken in the past? In these pictures, the woman sits in the chair. Her hands are bound, her mouth covered with tape. Her eyes are wide with terror, staring directly at the camera with an intensity that makes my stomach churn. Behind her, partially visible in the shadows, is another figure. The face has been scratched out like the others, but I can see enough to know the build, the posture, the way the shoulders slope. The figure looks like me. But that's impossible. I would remember something like that. You don't forget taking photographs of someone in distress, someone who clearly doesn't want to be there. The memory would be seared into your consciousness, impossible to erase or suppress. Unless you wanted to forget, unless the forgetting was intentional, a mercy you granted yourself to preserve what remained of your sanity. The woman's name was written on the back of one photograph in faded pencil. I can make out the first few letters, but the rest has been worn away by time and handling. It starts with an M, or maybe an N. The uncertainty gnaws at me like hunger. I've been having conversations with her, long, rambling discussions that take place in the space between sleeping and waking. She tells me things I don't want to know, shares memories that feel too real to be imagination. She says she's been waiting for me to remember, waiting for me to acknowledge what happened in that basement all those years ago. But years ago, I was somewhere else entirely, living a different life with different people. The timeline doesn't work. The mathematics of memory refuse to add up to anything coherent. The ropes have been moved. I arranged them in a neat coil beside the chair, but now they're spread across the floor in patterns that might be random or might be deliberate. They form shapes that could be letters, words spelled out in hemp and shadow. When I try to read them, the meaning slips away like smoke. The candle stubs have grown. New wax has been added, layer upon layer, building up into twisted sculptures that cast strange shadows when lit. I don't remember lighting them, but they burn every night now, filling the basement with their sweet, cloying smoke. She's getting stronger. Her presence fills the house like water, seeping into every corner and crevice. I feel her watching me as I move through the rooms, her attention like weight pressing down on my shoulders. Sometimes I turn quickly, hoping to catch her unguarded, but there's never anything there. Just empty space and the lingering scent of burnt wax. The mirror shows us both now, standing side by side, though I'm alone in the bathroom. She's shorter than I remembered, more fragile. Her dark hair falls across her face in waves, partially obscuring her features. When I reach up to touch my own hair, she doesn't mirror the movement. She just stands there, patient and still, waiting for something I can't give her. I've started leaving offerings, food on the kitchen table, water in small bowls, flowers picked from the overgrown garden. They disappear overnight, though I never see them being taken. In the morning, there are only empty plates and withered stems, evidence of consumption I didn't witness. The photographs continue to multiply. I find them in drawers I haven't opened, tucked between the pages of books, slipped under doors like messages from another world. They show scenes I don't remember living through, moments that feel both foreign and familiar. In some of them, we're together, the woman and I, standing close enough that our shadows merge. We look happy in those pictures, content in a way that seems impossible given everything else. Her smile is genuine, reaching her eyes and transforming her entire face. My arm is around her shoulders, protective and possessive. We look like lovers or like family, bound together by something stronger than blood. But if these moments existed, why can't I remember them? What kind of person forgets happiness while retaining only shadows and fear? The basement has become my confessional. I go down there every night now, sitting in the chair while she moves around me like a ghost made manifest. She doesn't speak, but I can hear her thoughts as clearly as if she were whispering in my ear. She tells me about the last night, about the candles and the ropes and the terrible understanding that passed between us. She tells me about the choice I made, the decision that seemed merciful at the time, but has become a weight I carry in my bones. She tells me about the promises I broke and the promises I kept, the lines I crossed and the ones I couldn't bring myself to approach. Most of all, she tells me about love, the twisted, desperate kind that consumes everything in its path, that transforms mercy into cruelty and protection into imprisonment. She speaks of love like a disease, something that infected us both until we couldn't tell where caring ended and obsession began. The floorboards above the basement have started to sag. The wood bends under my weight now, creating valleys and ridges that make walking treacherous. I can feel the foundation settling, shifting to accommodate whatever is growing in the darkness below. My reflection has disappeared entirely from the upstairs mirror. Now there's only her, watching me with eyes that hold knowledge I've spent years trying to forget. She mouths words I can't hear, her lips forming shapes that might be my name or might be accusations. The journal entries have become confessions. Page after page of admissions I don't remember writing, details of events I can't place in any coherent timeline. The handwriting is mine, but the voice feels foreign, speaking truths I'm not ready to acknowledge. According to these entries, she never left the basement. According to these pages written in my own hand, she's been down there all along, waiting in the chair with infinite patience. The photographs aren't memories of the past, but documentation of an ongoing present, evidence of a situation that never resolved itself. But that would make me something I can't bear to be. It would transform every moment of the last few years into a lie, every night of sleep into an act of willful ignorance. It would mean that while I've been living my life above ground, someone else has been existing in the darkness below, sustained by offerings and candlelight and the terrible consistency of my forgetting. The basement door doesn't close anymore. The hinges have warped, or maybe the frame has shifted, but it hangs open like a wound that won't heal. The darkness beyond has taken on substance, thick and viscous, flowing up the stairs like slow water. I can hear her more clearly now, not just thoughts but actual words spoken in a voice grown hoarse from disuse. She calls my name sometimes, long and drawn out, echoing off the concrete walls. The sound travels up through the floorboards and fills the house with its longing. She asks me to come down. She asks me to remember. She asks me to finish what I started all those years ago, to make good on promises I apparently made but can't recall making. The photographs have begun to move, not literally, but the scenes they capture seem to shift and change when I'm not looking directly at them. Expressions alter, poses adjust, shadows lengthen and contract with their own rhythm. It's as if they're alive, documenting events that are still unfolding. In the most recent ones, I'm walking down the basement stairs. My face is obscured by shadow, but my posture speaks of resignation and terrible purpose. Behind me, the house stretches empty and silent, all its secrets finally exposed to light. The woman in the chair has turned to watch my descent. Her bonds have loosened with time, or maybe I loosened them during one of my forgotten visits. Her hands rest free in her lap now, though she makes no move to rise. She's waiting for me to reach the bottom, to cross the space between the stairs and the chair, to bridge the gap between memory and truth. The floorboards are warm beneath my feet as I move toward the basement door. Each step resonates with unexpected clarity, the sound echoing through dimensions I can't name. The air shimmers with possibility, thick with the weight of choices made and unmade. Something shifts in the darkness below, and the quiet feels newly alive with anticipation. Story 7. The Phantom Tick Asterisk. The ticking was barely perceptible, yet insistent, nestled somewhere within the fabric of the room. It was a tempo that didn't belong, subtly invading the air as I entered. I tried to place it, locate it, but it slipped through the seams of the present, pulling at the edges of a memory I couldn't quite grasp. The walls bore no clock, and my watch was silent still. Each tick, perfectly timed, seemed to echo from a place I had once known, tight with anxiety and whispers. The air grew denser, pressing into my awareness like a shadow I couldn't shake. Though I wanted to dismiss it, every beat of that phantom ticking drew me further into its unsettling rhythm. I realized then this sound wasn't going to let me go. I had come here to clean out my aunt's house after her passing. The family had asked me to handle the estate, sort through decades of accumulated memories, and decide what stayed and what went. It seemed straightforward enough. But standing in her living room now, surrounded by furniture draped in dust covers and photographs turned face down on every surface, I felt something was fundamentally wrong. The ticking persisted, threading through my thoughts like a needle through fabric. I moved through the rooms methodically, checking every corner, every drawer, every shelf. No timepieces anywhere. Yet the sound followed me, maintaining its steady pulse as if embedded in the very bones of the house. My aunt had lived alone for the better part of 2 decades. The neighbors described her as quiet, private, the kind of woman who kept to herself, but always waved politely when encountered in the garden. She had been found by the postal worker after her mail had accumulated for several days. Natural causes, they said. Her heart had simply stopped. But as I began sorting through her belongings, inconsistencies emerged like cracks in a carefully constructed facade. The refrigerator was stocked with enough food for weeks, fresh vegetables still crisp in the crisper drawer. Her calendar showed appointments scheduled well into the following month. A half-finished crossword puzzle lay on the kitchen table, pen still uncapped beside it, as if she had merely stepped away for a moment and never returned. I found the first photograph tucked inside a cookbook, pressed between pages about roasting techniques. It showed my aunt standing beside a man I didn't recognize, both of them smiling at something beyond the camera's frame. She looked younger, happier than I remembered her in recent years. On the back, someone had written "Our secret place" in handwriting that wasn't hers. The ticking seemed to intensify as I held the photograph, the rhythm quickening just enough to make my pulse race. I set it aside and continued searching, but the image lingered in my mind. Who was this man? Why had she never mentioned him to the family? In her bedroom, I discovered a shoebox hidden beneath layers of winter sweaters. Inside were dozens more photographs, all featuring the same mysterious companion. They showed intimate moments, shared meals, walks through unfamiliar landscapes, quiet conversations on park benches. The progression told a story of a relationship that had clearly meant everything to my aunt, yet she had kept it completely hidden from everyone who knew her. Among the photographs were letters, carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. The handwriting was masculine, confident, filled with promises and declarations of love. But as I read deeper, the tone shifted. What began as romantic correspondence gradually transformed into something more urgent, more desperate. The writer spoke of complications, of people who wouldn't understand, of the need to be careful. "We can't keep meeting like this," one letter read. "Too many people are starting to ask questions, but I can't bear the thought of losing you. We'll find another way." Another, dated several months later, was more ominous. "I know you're frightened, but you have to trust me. What happened wasn't anyone's fault. Sometimes things just go wrong, and we have to live with the consequences. Promise me you won't say anything to anyone. Promise me." The final letter in the sequence made my hands tremble as I read it. "I saw you talking to that detective again. I thought we agreed this was over. You're putting both of us in danger with these conversations. Some secrets are meant to stay buried." I set the letters aside, my mind racing. What detective? What had my aunt been involved in that required such secrecy? The ticking in my ears had become almost deafening now, each beat marking the passage of revelations I wasn't sure I was prepared to face. A search through her desk drawers revealed a business card tucked behind a stack of utility bills. "Detective," it read, followed by a phone number I recognized as local. The card was worn, as if it had been handled many times, and there were pencil marks along the edges where someone had nervously traced the outline. I called the number, my heart hammering against my ribs. The voice that answered was gruff, professional, tinged with the weariness of someone who had seen too much. I wondered if anyone from the family would reach out, the detective said when I explained who I was. "Your aunt contacted me several times over the past few years. She claimed to have information about an old case, something that had been bothering her for a long time." "What kind of case?" "A missing person, young woman who disappeared about 15 years ago. Your aunt insisted she knew something about what happened, but every time we scheduled a meeting, she would cancel at the last minute. Said she wasn't ready, that she needed more time to think." The detective's words settled over me like cold water. I pressed the phone closer to my ear, straining to hear over the phantom ticking that seemed to be growing louder. "Did she ever tell you what she knew?" "Never got the chance. The last time we spoke, she sounded frightened. Said someone was watching her, that she might have made a mistake by reaching out in the first place. I tried to convince her to come in to tell us what she knew, but she hung up. That was about a month before she died." After ending the call, I sat in my aunt's kitchen, staring at the unfinished crossword puzzle. The pen had left a small ink stain where it had been resting against the paper, a dark blot that seemed to spread even as I watched. The ticking continued its relentless rhythm, and I began to wonder if it wasn't just in my head, if somehow my aunt's house had absorbed the sound of her anxiety, her fear, her guilt. I returned to the shoebox, examining the photographs more carefully. In several of them, I noticed details I had missed before. The backgrounds weren't random. They showed specific locations that appeared repeatedly. A particular bench, a distinctive tree, a section of pathway that curved in a unique way. These weren't casual snapshots of a romance. They documented a pattern, a routine. One photograph made me pause. It showed my aunt and the mysterious man standing near what appeared to be a construction site. In the background, partially obscured by shadows, was the figure of a young woman. She was turned away from the camera, but something about her posture suggested she was watching them, perhaps following them. I held the photograph up to the light, trying to make out more details. The woman appeared to be alone, isolated in a way that made my skin crawl. There was something predatory about the scene, though I couldn't articulate exactly what. The smell hit me then, drifting through the house like a memory made tangible. It was earthy, organic, the scent of soil after rain mixed with something sweeter, more cloying. I followed the odor through the hallway, past the living room where the phantom ticking seemed to originate, toward the back of the house. My aunt's basement was small, cramped, filled with the usual accumulation of forgotten belongings. But in the far corner, behind a stack of holiday decorations, I found a section of the floor that looked different from the rest. The concrete was newer, a slightly different shade, as if it had been poured at a different time. The smell was stronger here, rising from the ground like an accusation. I knelt and pressed my palm against the concrete, feeling for temperature differences, for any sign that the floor had been disturbed. The surface was cold, but not uniformly so. In one area, about the size of a person, the concrete felt different under my touch, less settled, less permanent. I found a crowbar in my aunt's tool collection and began carefully chipping away at the newer concrete. Each strike of the metal against stone seemed to synchronize with the phantom ticking, creating a rhythm that felt both urgent and inevitable. The concrete crumbled more easily than it should have, revealing dark soil beneath. The smell intensified as I dug deeper, becoming unmistakably organic, unmistakably wrong. My hands shook as I continued, driven by a compulsion I couldn't name or resist. Whatever lay beneath this floor had been calling to me since I first entered the house, drawing me forward with that insistent, phantom ticking. I found the first piece of fabric about 2 feet down. It was synthetic, brightly colored, the kind of material that would have been fashionable years ago. As I brushed away more soil, more fabric emerged, along with something that made me drop the crowbar and stumble backward. Bones small, delicate, unmistakably human. The ticking stopped. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own breathing, rapid and shallow, echoing off the basement walls. The photographs upstairs took on new meaning now. The mysterious man no longer a romantic figure, but something far more sinister. My aunt hadn't been hiding a love affair. She had been hiding a crime. But as I sat there in the dirt, surrounded by evidence of something terrible, questions multiplied faster than answers. Had my aunt been a victim or an accomplice? Had she helped bury this young woman, or had she discovered the grave later and been too frightened to report it? The letters suggested she had been trying to find the courage to speak, but they also hinted at her own complicity. I called the detective back, my voice barely steady enough to convey what I had found. Within what felt like moments, the house filled with official personnel, cameras, evidence bags, the machinery of justice grinding into motion. They worked with professional efficiency, documenting everything, treating my aunt's basement like the crime scene it had apparently always been. The remains were those of the missing young woman the detective had mentioned, the one my aunt claimed to know something about. DNA analysis would later confirm her identity, but I already knew. The photographs had told the story. A young woman who had somehow crossed paths with my aunt and her mysterious companion, who had perhaps seen too much or asked too many questions. But the man in the photographs was never found. Despite extensive searches, interviews with neighbors, and analysis of my aunt's personal effects, he remained a ghost. The detective theorized that my aunt had been protecting him all these years, keeping his secret even as it slowly consumed her from within. She was going to tell us, the detective said as they prepared to leave. I could hear it in her voice during that last call. She was finally ready to come forward. Maybe her conscience couldn't take it anymore. I wanted to believe that narrative, wanted to think of my aunt as someone who had made a terrible mistake in her youth and spent the rest of her life trying to find the courage to make it right. But doubts lingered like shadows in the corners of my mind. The house was empty now, officially a crime scene, sealed and silent. But sometimes when I drive past it, I swear I can still hear that phantom ticking, that insistent rhythm that drew me toward the truth. I wonder if it was really my aunt's guilt made audible, the sound of her conscience keeping time until someone finally listened. The case remains officially open. The mysterious man was never identified, never brought to justice for whatever role he played in that young woman's disappearance. My aunt took her secrets with her, leaving behind only fragments of a story that may never be fully understood. But I think about that ticking often, about the way it guided me through her house like a compass pointing toward buried truth. Sometimes I wonder if it wasn't guilt at all, but something else entirely. Sometimes I wonder if my aunt didn't die of natural causes, if perhaps her mysterious companion decided that her conscience had become too dangerous, too unpredictable. The thought keeps me awake some nights, listening to the silence of my own house, wondering if phantom ticking might someday find me too. Because now I carry part of the secret, part of the burden. I know where the body was buried, I know about the photographs, I know about the letters filled with threats disguised as love. And sometimes in the quiet moments before sleep, I hear it again, that insistent, rhythmic ticking, counting down towards some reckoning I can't yet imagine. The sound that doesn't belong, pulling at the edges of memories I'm not sure I want to grasp, drawing me deeper into a truth that may be more dangerous than ignorance. The case is closed, but the questions remain. And somewhere out there, a man who knows exactly what happened to that young woman walks free, protected by the silence of the dead and the uncertainty of the living. The phantom tick continues its patient count, marking time until justice finds its way home. Story 8. I stood at the top of the stairs, fingers brushing lightly over the cold railing. The narrow corridor below stretched into shadow, every inch seemingly familiar and yet foreign. The usual creaks sounded softer, as if muffled by an unseen force. A gentle draft whispered past, but not from the windows. It was as if the air itself was shifting. Each tick of the unseen clock echoed too perfectly, in rhythm with my heartbeat, yet dissonant in its constancy. I waited, muscles tense, for a sign, any sign that I should move or speak. Then my heart jolted. A rail bracket, one I hadn't noticed before, gleamed freshly polished, its sheen wrong against the surrounding dust. The bracket held my attention longer than it should have. Bronze metal, unmarked by the patina that covered every other fixture in this house. Someone had cleaned it recently, buffed it to mirror brightness while leaving everything else untouched. I ran my thumb across its surface and felt the slight residue of polish, still tacky. The realization crept through me like cold water. Someone had been here while I was away. Someone had taken care to clean this single piece of hardware with deliberate precision. The grandfather clock stood sentinel at the base of the stairs, its pendulum catching what little light filtered through the hallway window. I had inherited this timepiece along with everything else, though I couldn't remember it keeping such perfect time before. Its face showed the correct hour, minute, second, a reliability that seemed almost aggressive in its accuracy. The brass weights hung at precisely the right height, as if recently wound, but I hadn't touched the clock since moving in. The key remained where I'd left it, tucked behind the base, yet somehow the mechanism continued its relentless march. A photograph on the hallway table drew my eye as I descended. The frame sat at a different angle than I remembered, turned slightly toward the stairs as if positioned for viewing from above. The image itself remained unchanged, a family gathering from years past, faces smiling with the forced cheer of obligatory celebrations. But the glass had been wiped clean, free of the dust that should have accumulated. Someone had handled this frame, adjusted its position, perhaps studied the faces within. The thought made my skin prickle with unease. The hardwood floors bore no obvious signs of intrusion, yet something felt wrong about their surface. In the morning light, I could see faint impressions in the dust patterns, not footprints exactly, but subtle disturbances that suggested movement. The cleaning had been selective, careful to avoid obvious traces while attending to specific details. Whoever had been here understood the importance of subtlety, of making changes that would register as wrongness rather than evidence. A window latch in the living room caught my attention next. The brass mechanism gleamed with the same fresh polish as the stair bracket, its surface reflecting light with uncomfortable brightness. This window faced the garden, offering a clear view of the grounds and, more importantly, a clear view into the house from outside. The latch had been oiled recently. It turned with smooth precision when I tested it. Someone had ensured this particular entrance would open silently, efficiently. The cushions on the sofa held impressions that didn't match my own body. The depression in the center seat was too deep, too wide, suggesting someone heavier had sat there for an extended period. The fabric still held a faint warmth, as if recently vacated. I pressed my hand into the impression and felt the foam slowly expand back to shape, but not completely. Someone had made themselves comfortable in my absence, settling in to wait or watch. A coffee cup sat in the kitchen sink, though I distinctly remembered washing all the dishes before leaving. The porcelain showed no stains, no residue, as if it had contained only water. But why would someone drink water from a coffee cup? The handle was positioned at an angle that suggested a left-handed user, while I favored my right. Small details, easily overlooked, but they accumulated like stones in my chest. The refrigerator hummed with unusual quietness, its motor recently serviced or replaced. Inside, items had been rearranged with military precision. Condiments stood in perfect rows, labels facing forward. The milk carton sat exactly centered on its shelf. Someone had organized my groceries according to a system I didn't recognize, imposing their own sense of order on my chaotic storage habits. The gesture felt intimate and invasive in equal measure. A book on the kitchen counter lay open to a page I hadn't been reading. The spine showed no bookmark, yet someone had found this particular passage and left it displayed. The text discussed memory and perception, the unreliability of human recollection. Coincidence seemed unlikely. Someone wanted me to read these words, to question my own certainty about what had happened in this house. The basement door stood slightly ajar, though I always kept it closed. The hinges had been oiled like the window latch, allowing silent movement. A faint scent drifted up from below, not unpleasant, but unfamiliar. Someone had been in the basement, perhaps for hours, leaving behind only the ghost of their presence. I couldn't bring myself to descend and investigate further. Some knowledge felt too dangerous to pursue. Upstairs, my bedroom showed similar signs of careful attention. The bed had been made with hotel-like precision, corners tucked with mathematical accuracy. But the pillows were wrong fluffed and positioned for someone who slept differently than I did. The arrangement suggested someone taller, broader, who required more space. They had remade my bed according to their own preferences, then smoothed away most traces of their presence. A drawer in the nightstand sat open exactly 1 inch, revealing nothing but creating an impression of interrupted searching. The contents appeared undisturbed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that everything had been examined, catalogued, then carefully replaced. Someone had gone through my personal effects with professional thoroughness, learning my habits and secrets while leaving no obvious evidence of violation. The bathroom mirror reflected my face, but the glass had been cleaned with unusual care. No water spots, no fingerprints, just crystal clarity that seemed almost accusatory. Someone had spent considerable time in this room, perhaps studying their own reflection while planning their next moves. The thought of a stranger standing where I stood, using my space with such familiarity, made my hands tremble. A towel hung on the rack with mechanical precision, its edges aligned with geometric perfection. I never hung towels so carefully, yet this one displayed the kind of attention to detail that suggested military or institutional training. Someone had used my shower, dried themselves with my towel, then arranged everything to appear undisturbed while subtly announcing their presence to anyone observant enough to notice. The medicine cabinet contained all the usual items, but several bottles had been turned so their labels faced outward. Someone had read every prescription, noted every medication, perhaps photographed the contents for later reference. The invasion felt medical, clinical, as if I were a patient being evaluated by an unseen physician. My privacy had been dissected with surgical precision. A window in the spare bedroom offered a view of the driveway and street beyond. The glass was spotless, recently cleaned from both sides. Someone had positioned themselves here to watch for my return, maintaining surveillance while going about their other activities. The chair nearby had been moved closer to the window, angled for optimal viewing. They had made themselves comfortable while spying on my life. The closet in this room contained boxes of old papers and photographs, family documents I rarely accessed, but the dust patterns showed recent disturbance, careful searching through materials I had thought safely forgotten. Someone was researching my history, building a profile from the accumulated detritus of years past. They knew things about my family that I had tried to forget. A heating vent near the floor had been unscrewed and replaced, the screws showing fresh tool marks. The opening was large enough for someone to hide recording equipment or cameras, turning my own house into a surveillance network. I couldn't bring myself to look inside. Some violations were too complete to confront directly. The kitchen telephone showed signs of recent use, though I rarely made calls from the landline. The receiver bore faint fingerprints, and the cord had been straightened as if someone had paced while talking. They had used my phone to communicate with unknown parties, perhaps reporting on their findings or receiving new instructions. My home had become their operational base. A chair in the dining room faced away from the table, positioned to observe both the front door and the staircase. Someone had sat here for extended periods, maintaining watch over the house's main traffic patterns. The seat cushion retained the impression of patient waiting, of someone comfortable with surveillance and observation. They had studied my home like a scientist examining a specimen. The front door lock showed microscopic scratches around the keyhole, evidence of professional lock-picking tools, but the damage was minimal, almost artistic in its precision. Someone with considerable skill had gained entry without breaking or forcing anything. They had treated my security as a puzzle to be solved rather than an obstacle to be overcome. A plant near the window had been watered recently, its soil dark with moisture. I had neglected this plant for weeks, expecting to find it wilted or dying. Instead, it flourished under the care of my uninvited guest. Someone had taken responsibility for maintaining my household, imposing their own standards of care and attention. The gesture felt both nurturing and deeply unsettling. The final detail that stopped my breath was the simplest: a single hair on the bathroom sink, dark and coarse where mine was light and fine. Physical evidence of the intruder's presence, left behind either carelessly or deliberately. Someone had been living in my house, using my facilities, caring for my possessions, and studying my life with the dedication of a scholar or the patience of a predator. But as I reached to collect this evidence, a draft from an unknown source lifted the hair and carried it away, leaving me with nothing but questions and the growing certainty that they would return. Story 9. It always began with the third step on the old staircase, a soft creak that seemed to echo a promise of routine. Each morning I listened for it, a comfort in its predictability as I prepared for the day. But yesterday there was a pause before the sound, an offbeat that caught in my thoughts like a splinter. Today it was silent. The absence lingered, unraveling the morning's calm like a thread pulled loose from a once tight seam. I wait again, but the step remains quiet, and now I wonder if it ever creaked at all. The coffee grows cold in my hands. Steam dissolves into nothing like trust. I remember the day she moved in upstairs, heavy footsteps, boxes dragging across the floor, a rhythm I learned to anticipate, then depend on. The third step became her signature, a gentle announcement that the day was beginning properly. I never saw her face clearly, only glimpses through the frosted glass of the front door. Dark hair maybe, a blue coat that she wore even when it wasn't cold. The landlord mentioned her once, said she worked nights. That explained the afternoon sounds, the way the floorboards spoke when most people were at work. I began to map her movements through the ceiling. Kitchen at 2, bathroom at 3, the long silence that meant sleep. But silence can lie. I found the first note on a Tuesday, slipped under my door while I was out, folded twice, written in pencil on lined paper torn from a spiral notebook. "Do you hear them too?" it asked, nothing more. The handwriting was careful, deliberate. Each letter formed with the precision of someone who wanted to be understood. I kept the note, placed it on the kitchen counter where I could see it while washing dishes, while eating breakfast, while waiting for the third step to creak. The second note came 3 days later. They walk when she's supposed to be sleeping. This time the pencil had pressed harder into the paper. I could feel the indentations on the back, like braille for the anxious. I began to listen more carefully. The footsteps above weren't always hers. Sometimes they were heavier, more deliberate. Sometimes they paced, back and forth across the living room, from the window to the door and back again. The pattern was hypnotic, almost meditative, but wrong somehow, like a heartbeat with an irregular rhythm. I started keeping a journal, not of events exactly, but of sounds. The time the pacing started, how long it lasted, whether it was one person or two. The pages filled quickly with my careful handwriting, timestamps and descriptions that began to form a map of something I couldn't yet name. The third note was different, longer. She leaves at sunset, but the lights stay on. The shadows move behind the curtains, but they're the wrong shape. Too tall, too angular. I think she's in trouble. I studied the handwriting more closely. The same careful formation, but shakier now. The pencil had broken twice, leaving gaps in the words that had been filled in with a different pressure, a different urgency. Who was writing these notes? I realized I had never seen any other tenants in the building. The mailboxes in the lobby showed 3 apartments, but I only ever heard sounds from upstairs. My own apartment, the one above. The third remained silent, its mailbox empty, its windows dark. The night I decided to investigate, the pacing upstairs was particularly intense. Back and forth, with an urgency that made my own pulse quicken. I climbed to the second floor, my feet finding the spots on each step that wouldn't creak. A skill I had developed without realizing it, as if my body knew this moment would come. The hallway was darker than it should have been. The overhead light worked in my apartment, but here it flickered weakly, casting shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. 2 doors faced each other. One had a brass number that caught what little light there was. The other was unmarked. I pressed my ear to the marked door. The pacing had stopped. Inside, I could hear something else. Soft sounds, rhythmic but muffled, like someone working with their hands, folding, unfolding, paper rustling. The unmarked door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open with one finger. The apartment was a mirror image of mine, but empty. No furniture, no belongings, no signs of habitation, just bare walls and dusty floorboards. The windows were clean, though, and through them I could see into the apartment across the hall, the one where she lived, where someone lived. A woman sat at a small table, writing. Her dark hair fell across her face as she worked, and she wore the blue coat I had glimpsed so many times. She wrote steadily, filling page after page with careful handwriting. When she finished each note, she folded it twice and placed it on a growing stack beside her elbow. I watched her for a long time. She never looked up, never paused, never seemed to notice that her lights were on and her curtains were open. The pacing I had heard was her, walking from the table to the window and back again, checking something I couldn't see. When I finally returned to my apartment, I found another note under my door. I know you're watching now, that's good. Someone needs to witness this. Someone needs to remember. The handwriting was mine. I don't remember writing it, but the pencil was on my kitchen counter, and my journal was open to a page I didn't recall filling. The entries were detailed, precise, documenting weeks of observations I couldn't quite place in my memory. The woman upstairs, the sounds, the patterns that had become so important to me. But according to my own careful notes, she had stopped making any sound at all over a month ago. The third step hasn't creaked since then, but I still listen for it every morning. I still wait for the confirmation that someone else exists in this building, that the routines I have built my days around have some foundation in reality. The notes keep coming though, slipped under my door while I sleep, written in my own hand, documenting things I don't remember seeing. They pile up on my counter like evidence of a crime I can't identify. This morning I found one that simply said, "Check the empty apartment again." I climbed the stairs, avoiding the spots that creak, and pushed open the unmarked door. The apartment was no longer empty. A small table sat by the window, and on it was a stack of folded notes, each one creased twice, each one written in careful pencil on lined paper. I unfolded the top one. "Do you hear them too?" The handwriting was careful, deliberate, but it wasn't mine. It was neater, more controlled, formed by someone who wanted very much to be understood. I looked across the hall through the clean windows of the empty apartment into the apartment where she lived. The lights were off. The windows were dark. They had been dark, I realized, for longer than I could remember. But I could see myself sitting at the small table, writing steadily, filling page after page with observations about sounds that might never have existed. My dark hair fell across my face as I worked, and I wore a blue coat that I didn't remember owning. The woman in the apartment watched me through her window, pressing her ear to the glass, listening for footsteps that would tell her someone else was real. I folded the note twice and placed it back on the stack. Tomorrow morning I will listen again for the third step to creak, knowing that the sound comes from my own feet as I climb the stairs to deliver another note, another piece of evidence that someone is watching, someone is listening, someone needs to remember. But I still can't say who is writing to whom, or which apartment I really live in, or whether the sounds I document so carefully are coming from above me or below. The step remains silent, and I wonder if it was ever meant to creak at all. Story 10. The Midnight Owl. It wasn't the first time I noticed the living room clock had stopped at midnight. The hands rested silently against the face as if pausing for breath, their stillness having settled with an odd familiarity. The newspaper lay neatly folded on the coffee table, the date always one day off. I hadn't read it in weeks, but it seemed untouched, as if preserving something that shouldn't be erased. Dust collected on the windowsill, yet I never seemed to wipe it away. I'd start the coffee machine each morning, listening to the quiet hum, not because I needed coffee, but because it had become routine. The air felt thicker on those mornings, though it was just my imagination, surely. I hesitated before turning the clock's hand back to the correct time. The battery wasn't dead. I left it as it was. The phone rang while I stood there, staring at those frozen hands. The caller's voice was familiar yet distant, like an echo from a room I'd forgotten I'd been in. She told me the investigation had been reopened. New evidence, she said, fresh eyes on old wounds. I found myself nodding even though she couldn't see me, my fingers tracing the edge of the coffee table where a water ring had permanently stained the wood. I'd been the one to find her. That detail never left the official reports, though they'd sanitized everything else. The woman who called me now had been her colleague, someone who'd worked alongside her for years in that cramped office building downtown. She spoke in measured tones, the kind people use when they're trying not to disturb something fragile. The scent of vanilla still lingered in my kitchen sometimes, though I'd thrown away all her candles months ago. I'd catch it unexpectedly while washing dishes or opening the refrigerator, a ghost of domesticity that made my hands shake. The detective assigned to the case had mentioned that detail during our first interview, how the apartment still smelled like vanilla when they arrived, how normal everything appeared except for the overturned chair and the broken picture frame. I agreed to meet with the new investigator at a coffee shop I'd never been to before. The building sat wedged between a dry cleaner and a used bookstore, its windows fogged with condensation that made the world outside look blurred and uncertain. She was younger than I'd expected, with careful eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw. Her notebook was already open when I sat down, pages filled with handwriting too small for me to read upside down. She asked me to start from the beginning, but beginnings are harder to pin down than people think. Was it the morning she didn't answer her phone, the evening before when she'd sounded distracted during our conversation, or was it weeks earlier when I'd first noticed how she'd started checking the locks twice before leaving her apartment? I told her about the spare key, how she'd given it to me after her sister moved across the country, someone to water her plants when she traveled for work. The key felt heavier than it should have in my pocket that morning, brass worn smooth from years of use. Her door had opened with the same soft click it always made, but the silence inside was different, expectant, waiting. The investigator wrote something down, her pen scratching against the paper with a sound that made my teeth ache. She asked about our relationship, how long we'd known each other, whether I'd noticed any changes in her behavior recently. I found myself describing things I hadn't thought about in months, how she'd started buying different groceries, brands she'd never chosen before, how she'd mentioned feeling watched while walking home from the subway, though she'd laughed it off as paranoia. The coffee grew cold between my hands as I spoke. The investigator's questions came in waves, each one pulling me deeper into memories I tried to keep at a safe distance. She wanted to know about the broken picture frame, why it might have been significant. The photograph inside had been of her college graduation, her parents standing on either side with proud smiles. The glass had shattered in a perfect spider web pattern, as if something had struck it with precise force. I left the coffee shop feeling hollowed out, like someone had scooped away parts of me I hadn't realized were still there. The investigator had given me her card, the paper crisp and white against my palm. She'd asked me to call if I remembered anything else, any detail that might have seemed unimportant at the time. Walking home, I noticed how many security cameras lined the streets. Small black eyes mounted on building corners, watching the flow of pedestrians with mechanical patience. I wondered how many of them had been there before, whether I'd simply never paid attention. The thought followed me up the stairs to my apartment, where the clock still waited at midnight and the newspaper remained folded on the coffee table. That night I dreamed about her hands. She'd always worn a silver ring on her middle finger, a simple band she'd bought for herself after her first promotion. In the dream, she was reaching for something just out of frame, her fingers stretched toward an object I couldn't see. I woke with the taste of vanilla on my tongue and the sound of her laughter echoing in the space between sleep and consciousness. The investigator called me 3 days later. They'd found something in the evidence room, a detail that had been overlooked in the initial investigation. A voicemail on her phone, received the evening before she died. The caller had hung up without speaking, but there was background noise, traffic sounds, and something else, something that might have been breathing. I met her at the police station this time, in a small room that smelled of disinfectant and old coffee. The recording lasted less than 30 seconds, mostly static, punctuated by the distant sound of cars passing. But at the end, just before the line went dead, there was something else. A soft intake of breath, almost like a sigh. The investigator played it 3 times, asking if I recognized anything about the background sounds, whether they might indicate a specific location. The breathing sounded familiar, though I couldn't place why. It reminded me of someone trying to speak, but losing their nerve at the last moment. The investigator mentioned they were working on cleaning up the audio, isolating the different sound layers to see what else might be hidden in the static. I found myself thinking about that voicemail constantly over the following days. Who calls someone just to hang up? The investigator had suggested it might have been a wrong number, but the timing felt too deliberate. The evening before her death, when she would have been home from work, settling into her usual routine of dinner and television. The vanilla scent appeared in my kitchen again, stronger this time. I searched through every cabinet and drawer, looking for some forgotten candle or air freshener that might explain it. Nothing. The smell seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, as if the building had absorbed years of her presence and was slowly releasing it back into the air. I started visiting the coffee shop where we'd first met, not the one where I'd talked to the investigator, but the original place. A corner booth where she'd always ordered the same drink, extra foam, no sugar. The barista remembered her, mentioned how she'd always seemed nervous, constantly checking her phone and glancing toward the windows. I'd never noticed that before, too caught up in our conversations to pay attention to her anxieties. The investigator called again. They'd enhanced the audio from the voicemail and found something interesting. In the background, barely audible beneath the traffic noise, was the sound of a specific type of construction equipment, the kind used for building renovations. They were cross-referencing construction permits from that time period, looking for projects that might have been active when the call was made. I offered to help, though I wasn't sure what I could contribute. She suggested I go through any personal items that had been returned to me, looking for anything that might provide a clue about who could have had access to her phone number. The box sat in my closet where I'd left it, sealed with evidence tape that had been cut and resealed after the initial investigation. Inside were the ordinary artifacts of a life interrupted. Her appointment book, filled with neat handwriting and small doodles in the margins. A collection of business cards from restaurants and shops, some so faded the text was barely legible. Her address book, the kind people used before everything moved to phones, pages soft with age and handling. I recognized most of the names and numbers, mutual friends and family members I'd met over the years we'd known each other. But there were others, entries in different ink that suggested they'd been added more recently. A locksmith, a security company, a private investigator whose business card wasn't in the evidence box but whose number appeared in her handwriting on the back page of the address book. The investigator was interested in that detail. We met again, this time at her office, a cramped space she shared with two other detectives. She called the private investigator while I waited, her side of the conversation consisting mostly of long pauses and single-word responses. When she hung up, her expression was different, more focused. The private investigator remembered her. She'd contacted him about 3 months before her death, concerned about someone following her. Not anything dramatic or obvious, just a feeling that someone was paying too much attention to her routine. He'd suggested she document any incidents, take photos if possible, keep a record of when and where she felt watched. But she'd never followed up with him. No additional calls, no reports of escalating harassment. The investigator had assumed she'd either resolved the situation or decided it wasn't worth pursuing. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, that silence took on a different significance. I found myself retracing her usual routes, walking from her apartment to the subway station, from the subway to her office building. The path took me through a small park where she'd sometimes stop to feed the pigeons, past a newsstand where she'd bought magazines, under a bridge where construction scaffolding had been erected and then removed. The scaffolding caught my attention. I asked the newsstand owner when it had been taken down, whether there had been workers there regularly. He remembered the construction project, how the noise had driven away customers for weeks. The work had been completed just around the time she died, he thought, though he couldn't be more specific than that. The investigator was interested in this connection. Construction workers would have had a clear view of anyone passing beneath the bridge, including her daily commute. They would have been able to observe her routine, note the timing of her trips to and from work, and the equipment noise would match what they'd found in the enhanced audio from the voicemail. We requested the employment records from the construction company, a process that involved lawyers and court orders and bureaucratic delays that stretched on for weeks. During that time, I found myself paying closer attention to the people around me, wondering if someone had been watching her the way I was now watching strangers on the street. The vanilla scent had faded from my kitchen, replaced by something else. Not unpleasant exactly, but unfamiliar, like the smell of rain on hot pavement or metal left in the sun. I mentioned it to the investigator during one of our phone conversations, and she suggested I have the building's ventilation system checked. Sometimes old buildings developed strange odors when the weather changed. The employment records finally arrived, a stack of papers containing names and addresses of everyone who'd worked on the bridge project. Most were routine entries, long-time employees with clean backgrounds and solid references, but one name stood out, a temporary worker who'd been hired just for that specific job, someone with no previous history with the company. The investigator ran a background check on the temporary worker. What she found made her call me immediately, her voice tight with controlled excitement. He had a record, nothing violent but a pattern of harassment complaints, restraining orders, charges that had been dropped or pleaded down to lesser offenses. A history of becoming obsessed with women he'd encountered casually, following them, learning their routines. We had a suspect, but suspects and proof are different things. The temporary worker had left the construction job the same week she died, giving no forwarding address and collecting his final paycheck through a third party. The investigator put out inquiries, but finding someone who doesn't want to be found is harder than television makes it look. I started having trouble sleeping. Not nightmares exactly, but a persistent awareness that felt like being watched. I'd wake up in the middle of the night convinced someone was outside my window, though I lived on the fourth floor and there was no fire escape. The rational part of my mind knew it was stress, the psychological weight of reopening old wounds, but rationality doesn't help at 3 in the morning when every sound seems amplified. The investigator called with an update. They tracked down the temporary worker's previous address, an apartment he'd rented under a different name. The landlord remembered him as quiet but strange, someone who kept odd hours and had installed additional locks on his door without permission. When he'd moved out, he'd left behind some items in the basement storage area. Among those items was a camera with a telephoto lens, the kind photographers use for wildlife or sports, but also the kind someone might use to watch people from a distance. The camera's memory card was missing, but the investigator was having the device examined for any recoverable data. I found myself thinking about all the photographs that had never been taken, all the moments of surveillance that left no trace. How long had he been watching her? What had he seen that I'd missed during our conversations, our casual meetings, our shared routines that had seemed so normal and safe? The camera yielded nothing. Whatever images it had captured were gone, erased either deliberately or through the passage of time and electronic decay. But the investigator had other leads now, other threads to pull. The temporary worker had used a credit card to purchase the camera, and credit card records leave trails that are harder to erase than digital photographs. Those records painted a picture of escalating obsession. Purchases at electronic stores for surveillance equipment, payments to online services that provided personal information about individuals, charges at businesses near her apartment and workplace, suggesting he'd been spending time in her neighborhood, learning her patterns, building a detailed map of her life. But still no direct evidence linking him to her death. No fingerprints, no DNA, no witnesses who could place him at her apartment that morning. The investigator explained the legal realities, how circumstantial evidence and suspicious behavior weren't enough for an arrest warrant, let alone a conviction. I asked what happened next. She said they'd keep looking, keep building the case, hope that something more concrete would surface. Missing persons reports from other jurisdictions, similar patterns of behavior, someone else who might have encountered him and lived to describe the experience. The waiting was the hardest part, knowing that someone was out there, that the truth was probably knowable but remained just beyond reach. I continued my routine of morning coffee and stopped clocks, but everything felt different now. The newspaper on my table seemed less like preservation and more like procrastination, a way of avoiding the present by clinging to an outdated version of events. Months passed. The investigator would call occasionally with updates that weren't really updates, bureaucratic progress that moved like water through sand. I began to wonder if the case would ever truly be solved, or if it would join the ranks of investigations that fade into administrative limbo, files that gather dust in evidence rooms while the people involved try to build new lives around the gaps where answers should be. Then unexpectedly a breakthrough, not from our investigation but from another case entirely. A woman in a different part of the state had contacted police about a stalker, someone who'd been following her, calling her, leaving gifts outside her apartment. When they arrested him, they found a storage unit filled with photographs and personal information about multiple women, including her. The investigator called me as soon as she heard. They were examining the contents of the storage unit, looking for any connection to our case. Among the photographs were images taken near the bridge construction site, pictures of pedestrians walking beneath the scaffolding, and in several of those images, captured from a distance with a telephoto lens, was her familiar silhouette. Finally, physical evidence. Proof that the temporary worker had indeed been watching her, documenting her movements, building the kind of detailed surveillance record that suggested dangerous intent. The investigator sounded more optimistic than she had in months, talking about search warrants and additional charges and the possibility of finally getting answers. But answers, when they come, are rarely as satisfying as we imagine they'll be. The temporary worker, when finally located and arrested, admitted to following her, to making the anonymous phone call, to becoming obsessed with her daily routine. But he denied being at her apartment that morning, denied any involvement in her death. His lawyer argued that stalking and murder were different crimes. That obsession didn't automatically escalate to violence. The physical evidence from her apartment remained ambiguous, the broken picture frame and overturned chair consistent with either a struggle or a simple accident. Without witnesses or DNA or some other definitive proof, the case remained legally unresolved. I attended his trial for the stalking charges, sitting in the back of the courtroom and watching him answer questions in a voice so quiet the judge had to ask him repeatedly to speak up. He looked ordinary, forgettable, the kind of person you'd pass on the street without a second glance. That ordinariness felt more disturbing than any dramatic revelation might have been. He was convicted of harassment and sentenced to time already served while awaiting trial, plus probation and a restraining order that felt meaningless given the circumstances. The investigator apologized, as if the limitations of the legal system were somehow her personal failure. She promised to keep the murder case open, to continue looking for new evidence, but we both knew the trail had grown cold. I went home to my apartment where the clock still stopped at midnight and the newspaper still lay folded on the coffee table. But something had changed. The waiting felt different now, less like anticipation and more like acceptance. The truth existed somewhere in the gap between what we could prove and what we knew had happened, but perhaps that was enough. The vanilla scent never returned to my kitchen. Instead, the air smelled like nothing at all, neutral and clean and empty of ghosts. I finally wound the clock, watching its hands resume their steady march around the face, measuring moments that moved forward instead of standing still. Sometimes I still think about that voicemail, the sound of breathing in the background static. Whether it was him rehearsing words he never found the courage to speak, or someone else entirely, a wrong number that coincidentally preceded tragedy. The investigator had been right about one thing. The more we learned, the more questions emerged, each answer revealing new territories of uncertainty. I kept her address book, though I'm not sure why. The pages still smell faintly of her perfume, and her handwriting remains as familiar as my own. Sometimes I flip through it, reading the names and numbers of people who have moved on with their lives, who remember her in fragments and anecdotes that grow more distant with each passing season. The case remains officially open, though I suspect it will eventually migrate to some administrative afterlife where unsolved files go to rest. The investigator moved to a different department, and her replacement speaks to me in the polite, professional tones reserved for family members who ask too many questions about cases that have reached the limits of available evidence. But I've stopped asking questions, not because I've found peace with the uncertainty, but because I've realized that some truths are too large or too complex to fit within the boundaries of legal proceedings and criminal investigations. What happened to her that morning exists in a space between knowledge and proof, between suspicion and certainty, and perhaps that's where it will always remain. The clock ticks steadily now, marking time that moves forward instead of standing still. I've learned to live with its sound, the quiet reminder that moments pass whether we're ready for them or not, And sometimes, in the space between one tick and the next, I think I can still hear the echo of that voicemail, the sound of someone breathing in the static, waiting for words that never came.